There we go. We're live. Thank you for joining the show, Tony. Really appreciate it. Now, I
Yeah.
want to walk everyone through your career. That's very interesting. You started out Harvard, bachelor's, master's, and then you went and joined Bessemer. And that's, I think, one of the most elite venture capital firms. I mean, among its portfolio, you've got Shopify, Pinterest, Yelp, LinkedIn, Twitch, all these really successful companies. You were an analyst, associate. Now you've got your own venture capital fund after working at Arcadia, another hedge fund for a while. I want to start with going back to your very, very early years, Harvard.
hmm
I'm sure
hmm
you've met a lot of great people there. When you went to Bessemer, and then now you've got your own venture capital fund. How important was education to the folks you work with? Was it something that they looked at, or even in the present today? Is it something a lot of you notice venture capitalists really care about? Because I've had a lot of conversation
hmm
with kids, guys my age, and they're at that intersection of high school's ending. They want to build something, and they're considering college, and they don't really know.
Yeah, no, look, I think that's a great question. I mean, short answer, I think education is important, but I think we also have to just be cognizant of the fact that, people learn in different ways, and also there are different sources of education, right? So I think I was just incredibly lucky and blessed to have ultimately attended Harvard. I think it was great for me, right? It's, having a structured, formal, college experience might not be ideal for everybody, but I just know that it was ultimately what I needed at that time in my life. But even beyond that, right? Like, I would say, there's the formal education, right? It's school, it's homework, it's classes, it's reports, and, it's exams, that sort of thing, right? That's important because I think in many ways that forces you sometimes to actually have to learn the fundamentals of certain topics. Let's say, for example, you want to be a computer science major, right? Understanding the theory and the fundamentals of software engineering, from the get go might actually be very helpful if you don't really have that much familiarity with it, right? But even beyond that, right, I think one of the incredible experiences that I had attending Harvard, especially as an undergrad, but then also again, with my MBA, is that I'm also learning simultaneously, not just from my professors, not, the actual text, I'm learning from my classmates, some of my, closest friends, right? I mean, whether it's like a random, 2 hour conversation in the middle of the night, where I'm debating with someone, and that fundamentally changes my perception or my perspective on, something that I thought I actually really understood, but someone actually lived in another part of the world, right? Like I'm talking about things related to politics, the social dynamics, right? But even the way that I even got into venture capital in many ways, I would actually put that on one of my close friends at school, right? Just by having a natural conversation. We're like, hey, yeah, like the Social Network is like a super popular film right now. This was around the time when Facebook was about to go public. Tech was becoming more and more of a dominant thing on campus. The questions that we just kept on asking ourselves was that like, who are these angel investors or VCs or, all these firms that are writing and sending, tens, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars, to individuals who are less than 3 years, where we are right now. Right. And, it was even just through that process of ultimately, learning and collaborating and asking questions in many ways, of our fellow classmates, also to professors, right? The real art of education in many ways is actually just the willingness to ask questions and, find those answers, right? That's the real value of education. Now, I was really lucky to ultimately go to an institution like Harvard. I think you can actually probably get that in a lot of great institutions anywhere in the world, right? The one thing though that I would say that, I'm particularly blessed, to have ultimately received at Harvard is just this incredible community of individuals, right, who are just deeply passionate about whatever they ultimately want to do next, right? So, I'm really fortunate sometimes that, some of my classmates, right, they have the level of passion, the access, the resources, in many ways, to be at the top of their field in a bunch of different spaces, right? In finance and technology and I mean, fill in the blank, law, right? Like, arts and media, right? So if I ever have a question, I'm still learning from them. All I just have to do is ultimately reach out and ask, right? Um, so, yeah, I mean, now your second question, is that really important? Personally, I think it is, right? But it also really depends on where you're ultimately starting from in life. For me,
Tony,
having, been an immigrant, yeah.
let me rephrase the question too. When let's say you're because the is it important is a very broad, very ambiguous kind of question with very
Yeah.
ambiguous answers. So let's be very specific. Let's say you're a young guy or lady and you're like 18 years old, 19 years old, and you want to build a startup. Ultimately, you want to solve problems. That's what gets you up in the bed, bed in the morning. Is when it comes to going to venture capitalists and asking for a check, how important
hmm
is college and sort of the prestige, especially of your education, when it comes to them evaluating you and your merit as a founder?
Yeah. Short answer, it depends on who the actual investor is, right? And just to be completely frank, I mean, this is, I would say, the complexity sometimes of the venture capital industry, right? Um, there are a lot of whether unconscious or very conscious biases that investors ultimately have, and it's really just in service of ultimately trying to find shortcuts of who to back, right? Ideas are great, they're plentiful, but like what investors are really trying to figure out is like, is this the right person who can actually execute? And sometimes a shortcut that people ultimately use is that like, oh, okay, well, if this institution, filling in a Harvard or Google, any, institution with some degree of credibility has ultimately deemed this person to be credible enough to be part of our club, then maybe this person is less risky than someone who didn't necessarily have this pedigree before. So for some investors, that's the way that they ultimately see the lens in the world. Other investors say, that doesn't really matter. I'm somewhere in between. For us, I don't think it's necessarily a guarantee that just because you attended a top tier institution, A, you should get funding, and then B, you're going to be successful. There are no guarantees in life. But I do think it also helps in a really, undervalued way, which is, oftentimes being part of institutions, like top tier schools or, top tier, firms, like a Google, like a Facebook, you're actually in many ways, the value that you're ultimately getting from those experiences is not even just like a degree or like, a line on your resume. It's the people, it's the network that can ultimately assist you in what you're doing next. Right. So oftentimes when I see individuals who've been part of those networks, then I know, perhaps, when they're running into challenges, they probably will have other people that can ultimately solve them. And that ends up being really important if you are a founder who's looking to scale from, 0 to 1, from 1 to 10, 10 to 100, you're going to need so many different resources, so many different experiences from people along the way. Maybe I can help with a tiny little bit of that journey, but for you to ultimately get to that, full vision, you're going to need a lot more people in order to help you, right? And, the quality of the network that you ultimately have, as a founder, sometimes actually really determines, just how far and as well just how quick you can ultimately move.
Absolutely. I want to talk about what you did after college, which was Bessemer.
Mhm.
Great venture
Yeah.
capital fund. Their portfolio is nothing short of remarkable. I know that you can't always reveal a lot about how their internal systems are and the kind of frameworks they use to evaluate founders. When I asked this to an investor from Sequoia, she kind of, she was like, I can't speak at all, but I can tell you about my colleagues there and how they thought about things. So, as much
Mhm.
as you can reveal, I know you work with a lot of different portfolio companies there. A lot of those portfolio companies went on to get acquired. What do you think it was about the way they worked that separated them from the kind of average venture capital funds in identifying great builders and great startups and then helping them, you know, go to that ultimate, goal of acquisition and achieving liquidity? What do you think it was about how they thought about things, how they evaluated things, to the extent that you can obviously reveal?
Yeah. Well, again, I think every single investor at the end of the day, over the course of their career, they find their own style that works for them, right? I think what makes Bessemer unique, and this is something that I also take to heart as I'm building and leading Kinfolk, is that you need to have two things work really well in order to be a great investor, but then also be a great supporter of your founders. Um, at Bessemer, I mean, I think one of the advantages that Bessemer ultimately has is that they tend to have a very analytical approach to wanting to understand business models, markets, and the reason why certain companies win in certain spaces over another. Bessemer for years has put out white papers, 10 laws of SaaS, that in many ways are trying to break down and explain, with easy to understand, metrics that any founder, any company theoretically can begin to use in order to assess, okay, like I'm building a company, but like, am I actually heading in the right direction, right? So, taking that analytical disposition, but then also simplifying it for the world to use. I think that's one of the, the great advantages that Bessemer has. I would say the second thing too that Bessemer also really does well is that, companies are fundamentally built by people, right? You can have the best business model, product, idea, but if you don't have the right team, the team that can execute, but then also, quite frankly, get along with each other, get along with their investors, the relationship side of things, that's when companies go sideways, right? The majority of, I would say, pre-Series A companies ultimately fall apart because of co-founder issues, right? So Bessemer's, I think, second strength is the ability to, in many ways, build great relationships with some of the great founders that the firm has been really privileged to work with over the last several decades. So in many ways, right, like it's the analytical side of things, but it's also, I think, the emotional intelligence that Bessemer has in order to form really productive relationships with people, so that the collaborative nature of the firm can really also drive those companies forward, right?
Absolutely. I think one thing that founders don't necessarily understand, and this is something from my own experience as well, is they don't necessarily understand how VCs evaluate their relationships with their co-founders. So you mentioned co-founders,
Mm.
you mentioned a lot of things that one of the really big things that leads to the death of a Series A company is ultimately a difference in strategy and vision between the two founders or many of the founders. And so what are some ways, one, if you're a founder, you can really tighten that relationship with your co-founders to make sure your company won't fall apart, Series A, Series B, Series C. And then second is, how do you then intentionally signal to the investors you're speaking to show them, look, we've got a really strong partnership here, and no, we won't fall apart. What are some ways you intentionally go about showing that?
Yeah. So I would say, the first couple of things that I always like to look for in any team, with multiple founders, is do they have complementary skill sets, right? If you have co-founders in many ways that you know look kind of the same, but we as humans, we tend to do that. Like, we just like to hang out with people who are kind of similar to us, right? But if you see co-founders in many ways that have very, very different strengths, but in many ways, when you combine those strengths together, you actually get a multiplier effect, right? So it's not even as simple as someone is more commercial, like it's more of a sales oriented person, and the other person is more of a like technical, like heads down type of worker, right? It's also about personality quirks. It's also about the ability in many ways to resolve conflicts, right? If you have two individuals who are kind of a bit chill, like two founders, um, I don't necessarily see that as complementary. You kind of want to have someone who maybe sometimes feels a little bit more comfortable being the bad guy, whereas someone who feels like a bit more reserved, because inevitably, as you're building a company, you're going to have different personalities, and each founder, as a leader within that organization, needs to be able to use their skills in many ways to navigate those challenges, right? So I'm always constantly looking for that complementary nature that exists within founders, right? Personality quirks, for example, but then also skill sets. And then lastly, yeah, the following question I also really push on founders is, look, like, you guys are complementary, but this also potentially means that, like, you guys yourselves are going to ultimately have conflicts. Conflicts in of themselves are not necessarily bad, but like, what I'm always trying to understand is, how do you guys actually resolve problems, right? And if you don't have a way, in many ways, where a strategic disagreement, or you have to make a really critical decision for the business, that one founder disagrees with, and another founder vehemently agrees with, right? If you don't have a process by which those challenges are resolved, such that people are committing and then moving forward, as opposed to the decision is made, but people are still furious about that decision that was being made. That's what actually gives me a lot of comfort that perhaps this is actually the right team to back. So again, complementary nature of skills, as well as I would say personality in many ways. But then importantly, I would say it's we're all different people, but like, do you know how you actually go about resolving problems between yourselves as co-founders? I mean, that gives me a lot more confidence that these are the individuals themselves who will continually, work to resolve problems regardless of who it is within their company.
hmm I want to dig a little deeper into that answer. So if I'm let's say I'm in a pitch meeting with you. I'm pitching you my product, and you kind of like the business model. Maybe it's a little earlier stage, so like these things are still being settled. But ultimately, you're looking at the team. You're looking at who's building this, and are they going to be able to last? And you asked me that very question. How do you guys resolve conflicts among yourselves? How do you resolve disagreements? How do you deal with disagreements? What
Mm-hmm.
should I because I think in a moment like that, a lot of builders they may not necessarily really know because they know how to build a product. They're good at building the product and solving problems, but they don't really understand that diplomacy side of things. That's
Yeah.
a part of like corporate politics essentially, and that becomes very important as you move through the stages. So, what should I say to you in a pitch meeting? What should my answer be, or how should I go about thinking about actually putting something in place to resolve said disagreements?
I think it always boils down to examples and case studies, right? Like even before you probably even started that pitch conversation, right? Like there was probably some kind of debate, whether or not like, which investors to prioritize, right? Like you might be super excited about, you know, brand name, VC fund. Whereas your, co-founder is like, well, that angel that we met, a few weeks ago, right? Like, fine, he's not from a flashy firm, but like, he just seems really cool and eager, and maybe, he can ultimately help open up doors, right? So always, I think it's always just about like being honest and then also giving like very, transparent examples of how decisions are ultimately made, right? Um, so yeah, like we had a really disagreement about like, the name of the company. This is how we resolve this, right? Or we initially did a pivot, but like this is how we ultimately made that decision together. To ultimately make that pivot. I'm the one who brought it up. My co-founder ultimately said, let's give it a little bit more time. Eventually we agreed that okay, based on these, certain, milestones, if we're not able to reach them, then we're going to do it my way. Once you actually begin to see the insights of how decisions are ultimately being made with very, very concrete examples of the decisions that were ultimately made before you're at that position where you're saying, all right, great, now it's time for us to fundraise. That's what, in many ways, I think begins to expose, as well as just articulate to investors that like you guys are very thoughtful about that question of you know how do we ultimately just manage this journey together, right?
Interesting. So essentially, it's kind of like when employers ask you, what is a problem you face and how did you solve it? They're really just looking for that logical framework that you used. And so in
Yeah,
this case, it's very similar. Like, tell me about like a time you had a disagreement, how did you resolve it? And what you really expect them is them to say, oh, we disagreed about the logo. So here are the compromises we made. I wanted a dolphin, he wanted a fish. So we did this and we compromised this way. And here's how we resolved
yeah,
it. So it's really just being able to point to those examples, essentially.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, I've even seen, look, so I've seen very different, I would say, companies and how those decisions themselves are. So, I mean, it's not like a right way or wrong way to do it. There's some founders and co-founding teams where it's like, I defer to my co-founder when it comes to anything related to engineering because like he is the all-star on that, right? So like if it's an engineering issue, right, like whatever he says, we're going to do. If it's a sales or a marketing or a branding issue, something that's more commercial, I ultimately take the lead on that, right? So like, and that's okay, right? But it's all about at least understanding, how this company is going to be operating moving forward, right? Such that as an investor, if there are future, disagreements, you can basically say, hey, look, I thought this is the way you guys were ultimately doing it. What's changed, right? So it's really about like, setting expectations, internally, but then also setting those expectations with your investors so that in many ways, if they have to, and look, most investors don't like to, but if they have to, step in and begin to resolve issues within the company, right? Then they at least know, okay, I mean, this is what, at least what you guys, claimed that you were doing. We're just basically going to, reinforce what you guys were already doing anyway.
Right. I want to talk about, so at Bessemer, one of the things that, your bio, you talk about is like having built a network of over 3,000 companies and
Mhm.
having sourced five of those companies, which, among them, about $36 million was deployed. I want to talk about some of those portfolio companies. I
Mhm.
know business model plays a big role. So obviously the market they're in, the total available market size, all these types of things, they're very specific mechanics of how a business works. But then I'm sure the founder and the team was also a big part of you essentially and the folks you work with deciding to deploy capital into those specific startups. So I want to ask
Mhm.
you, what was it about the way those founders approached building a relationship with you, approached answering your questions? All these types of different things that led you to ultimately having enough trust to then bring that deal, source it, and then say, hey, we should really fund these people. And I'm looking for really nuggets that founders can then take and kind of, engineer for themselves when they're talking to investors on like maybe tactics and things they use.
Yeah, I mean, look, to be, completely honest, I mean, when I first started at Bessemer, I mean, I was right out of school, right? So, I mean, I would say the people side of the equation, I was nowhere near as experienced as A, that I am today, but then B, as, some of, the individuals that I, was lucky to learn from, the people who actually led those incredible investments, that I ultimately ended up sourcing, for the firm. They, the people side of things, I mean, they just know cold because, I mean, they've been doing it for decades, right? But at least for me back then, I think the two things that always tend to resonate with me when it comes to founders, I mean, it still does today. It's just that I would say the other things, the other heuristics that I look for, I've just added more over time. But at least back then, the two things that actually really got me excited about founders was a, a certain level of understanding, passion, like commitment, to what they were building. Right? Is this a founder that's fundamentally excited about the idea and the problem that this product and service is looking to actually solve, or is this person just really building because that's what the market or that's what they expect VCs to ultimately want to invest in? Right. And you can typically suss that out actually, sometimes when you just ask, like, yeah, why are you doing this? Out of the million and one different opportunities that you can ultimately chasing, in the world, whether it's as a founder or even, working in a company or anything in between. Right. Why is this the one thing that you're ultimately, committing to? And I think even just by asking that question, you actually get a lot of insight into, who the founder or the founding team, their level of commitment to this particular company and idea is, right?
Tony,
And
before
then,
you
mhm,
before you move before you move on to the next answer, I want to
mhm,
dig in a little bit deeper. So you ask, why are you working on this out of the billions of different things that you could be working on?
yeah.
And then dot 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 they answer. What is what kind of answer are you specifically looking for? Is it like a personal
I
connection
don't
of, oh,
I don't know if there's a specific answer, but I think it's the level of authenticity about the answer that I think resonates with me in different ways, and it also resonates with other people in different ways. An example of an authentic answer would be like, look, I was in the service industry for a number of years, right, and like this was a constant frustration that I had, being an employee, at a restaurant. And because of that, right, I've just basically been tinkering on the side for years, trying to figure out, A, are there any products that can solve this? When I didn't realize that there were any, I was like, okay, well, maybe I can actually help build this. I found my co-founder who in many ways, discovered this problem, in a different way. This is something that we're really committed to, right? Because we've experienced that problem, ourselves, right? Having that experience that, and then also that second willingness to say like, okay, look, like this is a problem, it's annoying, but we also are committed to actually try to remove that annoyance. That ends up being like rather authentic, at least for me, right? But I mean, there are a bunch of different reasons and pathways that people ultimately get to. It doesn't have to be I have direct experience to it. I mean, some people are just like, yeah, like I've been really deeply researching, this space, trying to figure out, how we can ultimately, build something interesting. And, through all these things, I just learned a lot, right? And now I'm just obsessed, right? So it's like the level of, what draws someone in and makes them stay, fixated on that problem. I think that's what we're really trying to, find in many ways when we're asking those questions.
Hmm. Okay, so the first thing was your conviction and passion, and then you're gonna say some
Mhm.
else as well. What
Yeah.
was that
So,
thing?
and I think, the second thing that really matters, or at least, for me is, just how it's connected to authenticity, but I would also say it's transparency, right? And I think it's important for, one major reason. The moment that you're ultimately investing in a company, it's actually the start of the journey, right? I think most VCs will ultimately say like investing in companies is easy. It's everything else that follows that ends up being the challenge. And I think there's nothing more demoralizing and frustrating, at least from my perspective as an investor, when you don't have a transparent relationship with your founders, right? So you're providing capital, you're providing resources, but if they're simultaneously not actually you know telling you, well, it's not even just the truth, or like they're not presenting the company transparently, we can't necessarily help, right? If we don't know if there's something that we can help with, right? And I know a lot of founders in many ways, don't necessarily feel comfortable being vulnerable to investors, such that, hey, look, we're actually struggling with X, Y, and Z. Um, but I think in many ways, right, like, for me in particular, those are the types of relationships I always want to try to have. Like, look, I'm going to be fully transparent with you. And in turn, I want you to be transparent with me. And it's not just because, like, if you run into a problem, right, I'm going to, potentially fire you. I don't want, most VCs don't ever want to do that. What they're really trying to say is, if there's a challenge, just let me know so like I can actually be thoughtful and helpful. Whether I've seen this happen before, at a different company, or with a different investment, and I can help you find that answer or find that pathway to resolving that issue faster. Or even if I have no idea, there's probably someone in our network that we can ultimately find. I can at least begin to speak to you to figure out this challenge, right? So establishing that level of transparency, I think, ends up being critical, because that's the only way, in many ways, that we can actually quote unquote add value beyond that initial check that we're ultimately sending to the company.
Hmm. Before we start recording, we were talking about Africa, and we're talking about what you're doing at now your own venture capital firm, which is Kinfolk. And I want to tell you a story. Like when I was like a couple years ago, when I was a bit younger, we for the book summary platform, we had an intern from Botswana, and she was working alongside. We had a couple other interns from the University of Pennsylvania. They were working alongside each other. It was really interesting to see because on paper, one was in the U.S. and came from this prestigious college. The other was in an African country that a lot of Americans wouldn't even know it's a country, and yet they were very similar to their talent levels. And I just thought to myself, it's really interesting that kind of like playing field isn't leveled. One, because of where they are, they're seen as maybe a lesser developer, lesser talent. But the other one, just because they grew up in the U.S. and they're now going to American university, the kind of treatment they get and the kind of way employers will look at them is completely different, right? And so I want to ask you about your thesis around Africa. I know you relate to it a lot. You talk about how you want to make that idea of the American dream accessible to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you're building out of Nigeria, you're funding, entrepreneurs all across the continent of Africa. Talk to me about a little bit of the thesis there, and then kind of like the most exciting portfolio companies you've already funded at Kinfolk, and what they're doing and the exciting opportunities and trends that you see with the African market.
Yeah, that's a really good question. It also takes a really long answer. But I mean,
That's
if I
fine.
just
Take
had
as
to
long
even
as
just
you'd
give,
like.
if I had to give like a simple, one, phrase, there's, I can't remember exactly who said it, but it's, the phrase is, talent is equally distributed around the world, but opportunity is not, right? I think one of the remarkable things about the United States is that it provides a tremendous amount of opportunity for people, right? Just by virtue of it being the one of the world's largest economy, at the forefront of so many different industries globally, right? Some of the best education institutions, et cetera, right? Whereas just by happenstance of where we're born in the world, right? We can be incredibly talented people, but not necessarily be in America and have access to those opportunities, right? So I mean, I think that's what we really believe and mean, which is the entire opportunity set that America provides for people to pursue, quote unquote, the American dream, that should be something that's available to anyone, right? If you are an incredibly talented individual, you want to work hard, you want to build something of value, right? Whether it's a business, whether it's a community, whether it's anything else, right? You shouldn't have to only come to America. You shouldn't only have to be American in order to actually have that ability to build something of consequential value in the world, right? But I mean, even beyond that, right? I think for us at Kinfolk, how that really translates into our thesis is, because talent can be found anywhere in the world, especially across the African continent. We take a very much a proactive approach and say we need to go find the talent as opposed to constantly waiting for the talent to try to come to us. Because there's so many different barriers that exist in the world related to politics, related to economics, related to everything else that prevents otherwise really talented people from actually being able to access opportunities, right? So it's, you happen to be born with the wrong passport, which means you can't necessarily travel to certain countries. You don't have access to capital. You don't have anyone in your network that can introduce you to a VC or an angel investor, for your first, friends and family around in order to start building your company, right? So because of that, we take very much that proactive approach. And the way that we end up operationalizing that is we basically treated that, very similar to what a lot of other, startup companies would have to do, which is how do we actually use technology to go find people, right? We live in a world now where whether it's through social media, the internet, the fact that you and I found each other and having this conversation, right? It's just much easier if we really want to find where individuals who are talented, passionate, and are eager to build something, build a company, build a product can be found. So, we're scraping social media, so whether it's Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever, processing that information to at least begin to identify who's actually building really interesting things around the world. Finding great developers, whether in Nigeria or Ethiopia or even Botswana or everything else, and just trying to get a better understanding of, where are they working today? Does this person potentially fit the profile of someone who actually might want to build a company? And if so, let's actually begin to form a relationship with them proactively. And if and when that time is right, then we can actually provide them with, the first opportunity, whether it's capital or connecting them even to someone else who might be building something that's quite similar to what they're also passionate about, to begin to actually collaborate, and build something of value for Africa, for the rest of the continent.
Absolutely. Now, I really believe when I started building this show, I really wanted to engage the audience as well. And so this is
Mm-hmm.
going to be an audience question. It's something that the friend I mentioned who is building his own fund in Ethiopia, this is his thesis is a little bit different, and he had this specific question for you. So, just to give you a little bit of very short context, he's building a fund where he invests in a lot like, Kinfolk pre-stage to seed stage entrepreneurs, like in the
Mm-hmm.
very first few months of their journey. But he's focusing on API wrappers for AI that are
Mm-hmm.
looking to expand to the US and EU market. And his thesis is that's the fastest way for these entrepreneurs to generate return and reach a bit of
Mm-hmm.
liquidity. So he wants to know your thoughts on those kind of AI API wrappers that are looking to expand the USEU as investments, and if you think that's like a viable market, etc.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think AI is at the top of everybody's mind right now. And, quite frankly, like the space is moving so fast. Whatever I say, today might be like completely incorrect 6 months later, just based on whatever new model is ultimately released somewhere in the world, by Anthropic, by OpenAI, or anyone else, right? I think that's also like the exciting thing about this, space right now, but it's also, perhaps the confusing, complicated, maybe a bit scary thing, from an investing standpoint. In terms of the AI wrappers, short answer, I think it really depends on the use case, just how defensible it is, moving forward. I think there are probably a lot of great, software platforms, vertical software platforms, where you perhaps could do an AI wrapper, maybe like a chatbot experience or a co-pilot where maybe that's really defensible. But it's really because, you're actually solving something else, like, some kind of workflow optimization for a particular smaller vertical, which is why maybe that AI wrapper makes sense within that context, right? But standalone AI wrappers, I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of vulnerability, in terms of being disrupted, by some of the bigger, models, at least right now, from a commercial standpoint. Um, but I think the second thing that he ultimately was asking, which is building a business in many ways to sell to more developed markets, America, Western Europe, maybe parts of Asia, etc. I think that's actually very compelling. That's very spot on. A lot of our portfolio companies, the reason why we get most excited about them fundamentally is that they have a tremendous opportunity or potential to distribute their product and service, at scale across Africa, whether it's in Nigeria or elsewhere. But those exact same products and services can theoretically actually be sold elsewhere in the world. We're even beginning to see that dynamic play out with other startups, whether startups that were founded in India, like Zoho, right? And Zoho was basically building a bunch of, business operating or, CRM products, for small to medium businesses in India. They really cracked it in terms of distribution across, an emerging market like India. And that just basically gave them the skill sets in many ways to acquire SMBs regardless of, the economic context of where those small businesses are. Even a company like TikTok, right? TikTok starts off as social media, or ByteDance, starts off as a social media app, really just narrowly focused on the Chinese social media market. Did a lot of incredible innovation in terms of their underlying algorithms, such that the algorithm works for Chinese consumers. Does it also work for American consumers? And the history obviously shows that I think there's a lot to say about the algorithm serving content that is both enjoyable to Chinese consumers as well as American consumers, right? So in short, I think that's a very astute point. Like, can you build a product that can actually appeal to American, European, Asian markets? Yeah, you should totally be building a company in that fashion. I think the other nuance that we like is build a product that works in Africa. Because if it works in Africa, it actually might work everywhere else in the world. And if you can figure out how to actually deliver an exceptional product experience, in a highly efficient, highly scalable way, just given the constraints that Africa imposes on you, right? If you're able to master that in a really constrained environment, you actually might be able to build a really scalable business in a far less constrained, market environment like the United States.
Absolutely. And then I want to ask you, my last question to you is, I think that when a lot of founders struggle to fundraise, it's not necessarily because they suck at it, or it's not because that their startup is inherently bad, but they're approaching the wrong people. They're pitching the wrong
Mm.
funds, they're pitching the wrong angels, and that's, quite often detrimental because they waste hundreds of hours on the venture fund. You've got some poor analyst or associate wasting their time vetting these deals that aren't relevant. If you're a founder today and you're thinking about fundraising, what are some ways you can, actually identify the right angels and the right funds to approach? They're actually relevant, that are actually going to, that actually have any interest versus, vet out all the irrelevant and kind of funds that really don't invest in startups like yours.
I think that's a great question, but it's also a really hard question because there are a lot of reasons why things are not good fits, right? It's timing of markets, right? Sometimes investors are just in a fundamentally different cycle within their fund, so the types of companies they can invest in just have to be different, right? Sometimes it's also just based on certain investors really understand certain verticals markets. Like if you are a healthcare company, you should probably only really be pitching healthcare investors and not generalists, right? Because I think healthcare companies, funds rather, will probably understand your company better. But then if they in fact invest, they can actually be a lot more helpful, in terms of helping you build and scale your business moving forward, right? But even beyond that, right? Like you can have a great idea, you can have a great market, a great vision, but a lot of the reasons that VCs pass, especially when at least you're checking the box in terms of okay, great market, great product, is okay. What about the quality of the team, right? Is this the team that can actually take this company to the promised land? Or should I be looking for another team that might actually be doing something exactly the same or quite similar within this exact same space, right? So that ends up actually being one of the more underappreciated aspects, I would say, by founders. Like, I think, I mean, even I think myself, because I mean, VCs have to fundraise themselves, right? And I think, most founders don't, appreciate and understand that. Like, we have our own investors that we have to report to. I mean, they just happen to be called LPs. And, whether it's every 4 years or, 5 years or whatever, depending on the fund life, right? VCs are constantly fundraising as well. And so we have this exact same dynamic, with LPs. The thing that LPs are looking for is like, great, like, you get your product, your market, right? The types of companies you're investing in, that's what you're selling, right? That's your vision. But, who are you guys? Like, are you guys in fact backable, right? And that ends up actually being something that I think if founders themselves really leaned into, more so at the beginning stages of a pitch, as opposed to, these are my metrics, this is my product, this is why we're going to destroy competition. I mean, yeah, like that's all great in theory, but like it's the people side of things, right? Um, you know, are you going to take an otherwise great vision and product and, pathway and just get in your own way? That's what sometimes gives a lot, a lot of VCs pause, which is something that I think is not really communicated effectively sometimes to founders.
Absolutely. Well, we're at the 41-minute mark, so that's it for all my questions. Do you have anything that you'd like to add or talk about before we let you go?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess, I'm just going to put a shameless plug for Kinfolk, right? I mean, anyone in your, viewership, listenership base, for you, Burke, like if you're building a really interesting company or know someone who's building a really interesting company across the African continent, we want to know them. We want to meet them. We want to have that opportunity in many ways to form a relationship with them and help them achieve their goals. Not only just because we can make money, but the world just needs more entrepreneurs, to build for African problems, right? That's the real way in many ways that we begin to actually advance the continent, right? And if we begin to change our mindset as just seeing Africa as this poor charity case where I send a few, dollars annually or monthly or whatever, to a poor child in order for them to be able to, eat, as opposed to, no, this child one day can actually be the next Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or fill in the blank of your favorite founder. How should I be thinking about, supporting them and opening up those channels for them to actually build something, that not only changes their community, but potentially changes the world? That's how you begin to actually change, the African story.